All right. So as you can see, I'm going to do something today that I do intermittently, especially as we're approaching an election. And that is to not talk about the news of the week. And obviously, there's a fair bit. What's happening in Russia and the Ukraine is, I think, incredibly alarming. The Trump investigations are heating up in several regards. And we're just a month and a half away from national midterm elections. But having said that, I want to take the opportunity of the approaching elections to focus on an,
Please enter your PIN followed.
an issue that I think oh, is
Welcome to 8.
right now kind of simmering in the background, and you heard us, no doubt there was a little background noise there. I just muted everyone, but as always, unmute yourself, raise your hand whenever you have a question. You don't have to wait for a pause. You may remember last year there was a election in Virginia for the governor's position, and Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, won in Virginia, which has been moving in a Democratic or blue direction in most recent elections. And there was a lot of alarm and concern at the time from people who wondered what this might mean for what would happen in 2022. And if you remember, Glenn Youngkin campaigned dominantly on a single theme, which was that critical race theory was being taught in Virginia schools, and that if you elected a Democratic governor, they were going to continue to radicalize the curriculum of Virginia schools, and in particular to teach about race in a way that made white children ashamed of their ancestors and guilty for the nature of their society. And this proved a really potent mobilizing issue in Virginia politics. And I just want to suggest that right now it may be festering, it may be lurking in the background more than it is in the foreground, but that it may burst forth at any moment. And it wouldn't surprise me at all. The Republicans are struggling right now for finding issues that give them traction to turn this election cycle back in their favor. It wouldn't surprise me at all if this emerges in the final laps of this election as a really important issue. Even if it doesn't, I think we lose track too often of the fact that so many important American political issues are decided at the local or state level. And this continues to be a potent issue for mobilizing voters in local elections. And so the battle over American history and education is the focus today. I've put a few images on the board, several of them from the Black Lives Matter protests or from the recent killing of African Americans by the police. And I want to suggest, among other things, that you don't understand, you can't understand the protest over and the nature of racial asymmetries in American criminal justice without understanding American history. And I've also got an image of the Tuskegee Institute from over 100 years ago, an exclusively Black, historically Black educational institution. And part of the reason that image is there is to suggest that the accurate teaching of American history up until very recently has been almost exclusively confined to Black educational institutions, Black scholars, people who have a very different vantage on American history. And that part of what has transformed the academic study of American history over the last 50 years is the emergence of a really talented and insightful body of African American historians. And then finally, an image from the January 6th invasion of the Capitol, of a Trump supporter trying to overturn the outcomes of an election that put an African American biracial woman in the second most important office in the land, the vice presidency, marching through the Capitol with the flag of the Confederacy, the symbol of the states that broke away from the Union in order to preserve and expand the institution of slavery. And then one other thing that I think is too little noted about this photograph, if you look in the background, there's not only a Capitol police officer, I believe that is, standing by, but more importantly, a portrait of John C. Calhoun, the famous pro-slavery senator, the architect of the states' rights case for maintaining slavery and ultimately for breaking away from the succession of the southern states from the Union, and the person who delivered the famous Mudsills speech justifying slavery by suggesting that human subordination is essential to any society, and the South just does it with slaves. And if you note, right, Calhoun is not part of a exhibit about the problematic past of American Congress. No, he's got a dignified portrait, a beautiful gilded frame. There he is in the Hall of the Notables of American Congress. And lo and behold, a later day supporter of the Confederacy is marching past his portrait. That's an indication, it seems to me, of the failure of the United States to reckon with its racial history from the very top to the very bottom, from Congress to ordinary citizens. And I want to present you with some evidence of the idea that the American educational system is failing us. And I'm going to look at the Southern Poverty Law Center, an institution I think many of you are probably familiar with, but it's a not-for-profit that does very important research on hate groups and other aspects of racism in American society, and also has an active litigation branch that does a lot of the voter disenfranchisement and suppression, gerrymandering, etc., litigation in states that are increasingly turning to efforts to prevent some of their racial minorities from voting or from having the power that their numbers would indicate they should have in their states. And what they did, the Southern Poverty Law Center, was to assemble a body of some of the most eminent American historians and to ask them to devise criteria for evaluating the teaching of American history in American high schools. And so what should be taught? What information should be contained in the textbooks? What should teachers know? What should their priorities be? And what should students know at the end of high school if we've done a good job teaching them? And I'll start with the teachers for a moment. And I think one of the things to see immediately is that almost 90% of teachers agree strongly with the statement that teaching and learning about slavery is essential to understanding American history. And by the way, only 2% of teachers strongly disagree with that statement. Then look at the next column. My state offers support for teaching about slavery. Only 15% of teachers strongly agree with that statement, and 40% either disagree or strongly disagree. And so there's a mismatch between what teachers think is important in teaching American history and how they're being supported in terms of the resources that their school districts are providing them. And to drill down on that, the Southern Poverty Law Center then analyzed textbooks, and they used the criteria that were devised by this panel of historians. They put together a list. This should be taught, that should be taught, this should be taught, that should be taught. And then they analyzed the textbooks to see if they were making mention of what should be taught, right? And as you can see, right, these are the most widely used textbooks in the United States in 2018 when this study was conducted. And the best score from a textbook was 70%, right? Meaning that 70% of what should be taught is being taught, 30% isn't being taught. By the way, where I come from, 70% is roughly a C minus, right? And so this is not really flying colors for American textbooks, but then please note that 70% is the high score. The average score is more like 50%. So around half of what should be taught isn't being taught in the average textbook in the United States. And please note that some of these textbooks are teaching only 20% of what historians think should be taught. And then we could look in particular at the Texas and Alabama history books, and they are teaching 7% of what should be taught, or 93% of what historians think should be taught is being excluded from the curriculum of Texas and Alabama teachers and books, right? And this is obviously, I'll get into this more, deliberate, right? This is not just an omission. It's a deliberate effort to censor, to constrict, to distort the teaching of history in American schools, American public schools. And so then the predictable consequences, right? On the one hand, we see that when teachers are asked, do you teach the topics that historians think you should be teaching, that the highest number is around 70% of what should be taught is being taught. But on many topics, it is closer to 50% or less, right, of what should be taught is being taught. And then predictably, when you survey the high school students, only in the categories in which they do well, less than a third know, I'm sorry, less than 2/3 know what they're supposed to know, right? The high number here is 67%, what were slave patrols, and in a sense, the answer is almost contained in the question on that one. But if you look at many of these other questions, you're getting 22% in terms of knowledge of the history of the Constitution, its relationship to slavery. Less than 20% know about Nat Turner's slave insurrection. Fewer than 10% have an accurate understanding of why the South seceded from the Union, right? This is the bloodiest war in American history, and it is the case that over 90% of our high school students misunderstand its causes. So let me now just summarize these findings and juxtapose it with, I think, a really interesting observation about contemporary American politics. So there are 4 categories that the Southern Poverty Law Center used to synthesize its finding. Green would be passing, doing adequately. Yellow is doing moderately. Orange is doing poorly, and red is failing, right? And as you can see, whether we're looking at teachers' understandings and teaching of key concepts, students' understanding and teaching of key concepts, the textbooks coverage of teaching in key concepts or the school district's standards for teaching and understanding of key concepts, no category is actually adequate. And many of them are failing or doing poorly. And when I say this is deliberate, when I say this is policy, when I say this is the product of pitched battles at the local level for control over the school board in order to be able to control, among other things, how race is being taught in our schools, the context here, I think, comes out very nicely from this quote from a journalist, Adam Sewer, who writes this article, The New Reconstruction in the Atlantic, in the immediate buildup to the 2020 presidential election. He says the following: there has never been an anti-racist majority in American history, but there may be one today in the radically and socioeconomically diverse coalition of voters radicalized by the abrupt transition from the hope of the Obama era to the cruelty of the Trump age. And I want to focus on that transition for a moment and to point out, right, that I'll use Ta-Nehisi Coates as an example here, right? In his famous essay, My First President Was Black, and his claim that for African Americans, the fact of Obama's presidency changed the way they imagined American politics. They could finally think, as so many white people have thought throughout our history, that I potentially could be president. It's not an impossibility for somebody who looks like me to eventually potentially be president, right? And then, right, noting that's followed by the presidency of Donald Trump, and that the presidency of Donald Trump, in a separate article by Ta-Nehisi Coates, the first white American president, indicating that Trump is the first president who runs on the basis of his identity as white and a particular conception of being white American, in which you have differential privilege. And that privilege includes the ability to manifest out loud your discriminatory, biased, racist attitudes. I'm not going to talk about the Trump investigations today, but one of the things I just have such a hard time getting my head around, Letitia James, the Attorney General of New York, is bringing a civil fraud suit against Donald Trump, the Trump Organization, and 3 of Trump's children. And she's seeking, I believe, over $250 million in damages and excluding the Trumps from doing business in New York State. Donald Trump, reacts to this, has been reacting to it repeatedly by calling Letitia James racist. I think the only grounds he has for calling her racist is that she is a Black woman daring to prosecute a white man. But that is the kind of manifestation, the performance of white privilege. Any Black person who dares to challenge or indict a white person must be a racist, that Trump represented. And that it's not an accident that he comes on the heels of Obama. It's a reassertion in American politics of the importance of the exclusivity of white power to white self-understanding on the part of a substantial portion of white Americans. Not necessarily universal, obviously not. But having said that, right, that is the context in which a potential majority coalition to address the racism of American history, to oppose the racism of contemporary American society, has come into being. Sewer continues, all political coalitions are eventually torn apart by their contradictions, but America has never seen a coalition quite like this. So that's context number 1 for these controversies over education. Let me now point out briefly, and recognize there's something ironic saying briefly when there's this many ideas on the board, but some of the findings of contemporary academic history that challenge our conventional narrative of what our history is like, and that really should be reflected in an appropriate form in our history textbooks. Over the last 50 years, there's been this revolution in scholarship over American history. One way to refer to this is it has centered race. It has, that is to say, suggested that race needs to be at the center of any adequate story we tell about American history. And at the same time, it has used archival evidence. It has used a new critical lens or vantage to look honestly at the way race has functioned at different moments in American history. These are some of the key lessons of this new scholarship. And I want to emphasize, of course, that part of what matters in this scholarship is that African American scholars, not by themselves, but certainly have become a dominant force in the study of American racial history. And obviously, they approach that history from a somewhat different perspective than white scholars, to say the least. So the first big idea here: hierarchical racial order is a constitutive element of the basic structure of American society, right? You can't tell the history of America adequately without looking at racial hierarchy as one of its key components. Second, race and racial orders are not natural, but socially constructed, right? And part of what these historians will tell you is that in the 17th century, especially the early 17th century, race was not understood in the way it was in the second half of the 17th century, or the 18th or the 19th or the 20th century, right? And so this is, there's nothing given. This is constructed, and it's constructed politically. We have imposed, this is the next idea, we have created the social order by inventing race, the way in which the concept, the category, the identity is used in American culture and politics. And in inventing race, we've also invented the racial caste system, right? A fundamental hierarchical idea that you inherit certain inborn characteristics based on something as superficial as your phenotype. And those characteristics are relevant in determining a fixed hierarchy of human nature, hence a caste system. Also, a consequence of noting the constructed nature of racial order, racial orders change and evolve over time. And we can trace this history, and in tracing this history, we can trace it back to our laws and our culture, and we can also see how malleable and contingent racial categories are, which give us a stronger sense then of the possibility of ongoing change and reform in the present. Fifth, the evolution of racial order over time cannot be understood as progress. As much as we would like to tell ourselves this story, racial order evolves and responds to ways in which it is challenged so that its core hierarchies can be maintained even while its operation changes, right? And I think that idea is the most challenging of these ideas. I think there's a desire on the part of many white Americans to say, well, you know, the history of the United States was bad up until the Civil War, but then we fought a war and we overcame the institution of slavery. Oh yeah, well, there's that issue about Jim Crow. So there was a second bad historical epoch. But look, the civil rights movement succeeded. And therefore, at least since 1965, we've put this behind us. And what this history does, and I think the history of the 20th century is extremely important here, is it shows, well, yes, there has been some progress. Obviously, we don't live in a slave society. We don't have the institutions of systematic racial disenfranchisement or the use of violence with complete impunity to terrorize African Americans into subordination that we had for most of our history. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a racial order to the present, that our current inequalities don't reflect the work of the law, of policy, of institutions, of the power structure of American society. So the sixth and final aspect of this history that I want to emphasize is that there are no features of American history and society that are untouched by race. And that's a sweeping statement, and probably somebody can find something somewhere that perhaps defies it. But as a whole, we miss essential attributes, core features of American history, if we try to marginalize race, try to treat it as not a central feature, but just an unfortunate sidebar on American history. So having surveyed a little bit of that historical transformation, I want to then talk for a moment about its contemporary implications. And I'll be quick here. This is stuff we've talked about together before. Many of the most problematic features of American society today and historically cannot be understood in the absence of understanding race. And so what's wrong with our criminal justice system, what's wrong with our education system, what's wrong with our housing, what's wrong with our medical system, what's wrong with our wage structure and the degree of inequality in the United States, every aspect of that has an essential racial component. You might say that race is, if not the primary, one of the primary variables in explaining almost everything that most Americans are unhappy with in the contemporary United States. Second implication, racial inequality remains a fundamental feature of America today, and present day racial inequality stems directly from our evolving racial caste system. And once we understand that history, we know that that means that present day racial inequality represents and stems from social and political forces that are clearly unjust. Next contemporary implication, we cannot solve many of the most urgent problems we face today unless we also address racial justice, right? That stems directly from this idea that our most problematic features of our society are rooted in race. We can't simply sweep that under the carpet and try to fix them without also addressing racial injustice. And then finally, and I've spoken with you in particular about, I think, Heather McGee's very convincing argument to this effect in The Sum of Us, we will all be much better off as individuals and as society if we repair the wounds of racial inequality and injustice, but we can only do that together, right? And so the claim here is that we are divided, we are split, we are fragmented, we are hostile, radically polarized in terms of our partisanship, and that this is impairing our ability to get so many urgent things done in our society, whether it's fighting global climate change or the pandemic, or addressing economic inequality, or creating more humane and respectful working conditions for the large portion of American workers who are poorly treated in their workplace. And we could keep going, right? Strengthening the union movement, improving American education, improving the housing stock. All of this would work better if we could work together in interracial coalitions, as is happening at the local level in many communities in the United States. But as a nation, we seem completely incapable of overcoming our divisions. And race is absolutely integral to understanding those divisions. So again, right, critical things to understand in our history, critical implications of that history. The academic historians think that this is irresistible. Once you take up the right perspective, once you reckon with the right facts, this is simply the consensus view of most academic historians in the United States today. Now, let me talk for a few minutes about the 1619 Project, which appeared in August of 2019 on the 400th anniversary of the first importation of African American slaves to the territory that would eventually become the United States, a project which was anchored by the journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones, who won a Pulitzer Prize for her work on this project. That adds to her astounding list of accolades, which includes a MacArthur Genius Grant. She is a professor of journalism and the head of the Journalism and Democracy Center at Howard University. And this project, I want to suggest, tries to do a really essential task in the civic culture of a country. It tries to bring the academic history, the history that's being created by scholars doing the dirty gray on gray work of going through the archives and uncovering new information and writing scholarly articles and tomes. It tries to take the basic import of this new historical consensus and translate it into a new narrative of American history that can serve for our popular historical self-understanding, the kind of history that could be taught in schools, the kind of history that we can read in popular history books, the kind of history that lurks in the background as we tell the story of what makes us a nation, a people, a group that has common concern for each other, that shares a political identity in a project. And so the 1619 Project was originally published as a New York Times Sunday magazine issue. But already when Nicole Hannah-Jones conceived of this project, she said she wanted it to be much more than a Sunday magazine article. And what she said in particular is, look, she looked at the Southern Poverty Law Center report and said, teachers don't have access to what they need in the classroom to do what they want to do. And as a result, our high school students don't know what they're supposed to know. But in the 21st century, we don't have to go school board by school board trying to take them over. We can make this material available as an online curriculum. And the vast majority of teachers in the United States, they teach in smart classrooms. They have computers that they can project onto boards and share the curricula that we generate with their classes and bypass the petty and vicious politics of school boards, right? And the New York Times liked this idea. I think it's an interesting reflection. Sorry. An interesting reflection on the transformation of the American media ecosystem, that the New York Times would do this after having been for much of its history the bullhorn of a very different kind of understanding of race and history. And so when Hannah-Jones won the Pulitzer Prize, the Pulitzer Committee actually started organizing workshops and events to train teachers to use the 1619 Project to teach in their classrooms. Eventually, the New York Times published a much expanded and really wonderful version of the 1619 Project as a book. Let me just show you a little bit about this book. This is just the first page of the table of contents. It's now over 400 pages long. It contains articles on the origins of American history, the history of democracy, race, sugar, citizenship, politics, justice, and all of them framed from the perspective that the true start of American history is 1619, that we can tell the story of American history as beginning with the institutionalization of slavery and racial hierarchy. And I'll just tell you very quickly, and looking around to see if I have the book, right? So I'm teaching at Sarah Lawrence this book, and it's a wonderful book. It's by James Kloppenberg, I guess I can put it right side up, of Harvard University, an eminent historian. Toward Democracy, the Struggle for Self-Rule in European and American Thought. As you can see, it's compendious. It's more than 800 pages long. It has a long chapter on colonial America. And in that chapter, he devotes, I think it's close to 60 pages exclusively to New England. And then there are 4 pages on Virginia, right? And someone like Hannah Jones will say, wait a sec, Professor Kloppenberg, Virginia actually predates by a few years the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Virginia is the origin of this institution that came to spread throughout the British colonies in North America and then came to dominate American history. Why 60 pages to 4 on our history? We need to flip that presumption and start paying more attention to this institution. So there are wonderful photographs that are, contemporary and historical. There are poems, there are stories, there's very powerful writing from some of the best journalists and scholars working in the United States today. And I will just point out, rather than being celebrated, I think as it should be, as perhaps the most important hinge connecting the detailed, important, but esoteric scholarly work being done in the academy today with a narrative capable of informing high school students' understanding of American history and average Americans' ability to tell that history more accurately and insightfully, as opposed to being applauded in many circles. This work is condemned and demonized. And so I focus on 1619 for a moment, just to return us to this history and the politics of history. Now, having said that, right, this book is published in August of 1619, and less than a year later, right, we have the police murder of George Floyd, right? And so I want to suggest that the other context here is not just a debate about history, but it is a confrontation with racial power relations and irresistible reckoning that the awful, brutal, distilled image of hierarchy and subordination that the 6-minute video of this murder put on such clear display caused, right? And of course, it wasn't this murder in isolation. As you're well aware, this was one of hundreds of African Americans who were killed by the police just in a few years, right? And there's kind of a steady drumbeat of this. And the result was that in the summer of 2020, the United States erupted in protests. This map shows you protests of 500,000 or more people, 100,000 or more people, but also the little dots are protests of fewer than 50,000 people. And as the images I began with display, these were not just African Americans going to the streets to protest their disproportionate killing at the hands of the police. this was white people, this was Asians, this was Latinos. And please note that many of these little protests occurred in conservative states, occurred in towns that were exclusively white, and even in conservative all white towns, there were people taking to the streets to hoist the flag of Black Lives Matter. And so this is, I think, also an essential part of the context to understanding the controversy of American history. Goes back to that quote by George Seward that we, for the first time, may have a majority who really wants to confront this, who really wants the reckoning, who really wants to address racial injustice in the contemporary United States. And of course, the other aspect of the context here is the coronavirus pandemic and the very strong racial asymmetry in the public health data, especially in the first 6 months of the pandemic, with far more African Americans and Latinos contracting and succumbing to the disease, in part because of the way they work, the way they live, their inability to stay at home, shelter in place. And then we return and compare that to what we know about police violence and the fact that police kill Black people at 3 times the rate of white people, despite the fact that white people are actually more likely to be armed when they encounter the police than Black people, that there's very little accountability for the police when they kill Black people, even when the evidence seems to point to the fact that it was unjustified or disproportionate force, that we have a huge mass incarceration crisis in the United States, that it persists despite the fact that the crime rate has gone down dramatically. There's no relationship really between the crime rate and the incarceration rate, or if there is a relationship, it's an inverse relationship. As crime goes down, incarceration goes up. And then, of course, we note, and by the way, African Americans are incarcerated at the highest rate of any racial group in the United States, roughly 5 times as often as white Americans in terms of proportions of the population. And by the way, whites and Blacks commit crimes at almost identical rates, right? So this reflects injustice within the criminal justice system, not a reaction to crime. And then we look at the fact, finally, that reform works, right? That we know that we can actually bring the rate of police killings down, perhaps even to 0 or much lower in terms of their disproportion, if we force police departments to reform, right? So the protests were motivated by all of this, and they resulted in a real and important but short-lived shift in American public opinion. For a brief period in June of 2020, after the American public as a whole said, we trust Black Lives Matter protesters and the message they're conveying more than we trust law enforcement. Please note this snapback, and we're back to a point where there's much higher trust in law enforcement than Black Lives Matter. Similarly, for this brief moment in the summer of 2020, white Americans supported Black Lives Matter more than they opposed it. Again, snap back, and we're back to the place now where, although a substantial portion of white Americans, more than a third, supports Black Lives Matter, 50% oppose it, right? How did this happen? Again, we know the story. Concerted efforts by conservatives in various halls of power in the United States. We could talk about what Donald Trump and the Republican Party did, but let's concentrate on the media, and in particular, right, the fact that Fox News and CNN and MSNBC covered protesting at similar levels, but that Fox News emphasized looting at more than double the rate that CNN or MSNBC emphasized rioting at about 4 times the rate of CNN and MSNBC. There was a deliberate effort to stoke white fear. and to turn white conservative opinion against Black Lives Matter. And I think that amplifies, right, the hostility to the 1619 Project or to the effort to reform American public education so that it actually reflects the current scholarly understanding of American history, so that our students begin to come to have an accurate understanding of our history. So when we now get back to the details of the politics of education, what you can see is that there are 36 states in the United States where there are efforts underway to restrict education on racism, right? Texas makes it illegal to mention the name, for instance, of Frederick Douglass. I think many historians would regard Frederick Douglass, right, the escaped slave who eventually wrote one of the most influential slave narratives, who became a very important public speaker in the abolitionist movement, who met multiple times with Abraham Lincoln, right, as one of the, let's call him, 100 most important people in American history. You can't say his name in a Texas classroom without putting your job in jeopardy, right? There are also 17 states that are trying to expand the teaching and the quality of their curriculum when it comes to teaching about racism. And I want to note, if you're doing the math right, you might notice 36 plus 17, that's a little bit more than the number of states we have, right? 53, not 50. And part of what you should then, I think, conclude is that America does not have an education system, nor does, for instance, the state of Washington, which is both in red and blue, or the state of New York, where I am, both in red and blue. It has multiple thousands of education systems, right? District by district, with school boards and superintendents making these decisions, so that different districts in the same state, especially states that have progressive cities and conservative ex-urban or rural areas, are actually implementing both of these reforms, restricting and expanding education about racism and slavery at the same time. So I want now to get a little bit more analytical with you for a few minutes, and to talk about, in particular, why history, race, slavery, and education have emerged as culture war issues this decade, and may very well intrude into our national elections, certainly are intruding into our local elections in this election cycle that we're in the midst of. And I want to start with the idea that it's not the content of the 1619 Project that's driving the reaction. I've actually had the experience of talking to some critics of the 1619 Project, some people who've written publicly about it, and I've just asked them, well, let's talk about the particular essays in that project. I understand you don't like the project. I want to know what you object to about Nicole Hannah-Jones' essay about democracy, or Jamil Bouie's essay about politics, or Dorothy Roberts' essay about race. And very quickly it becomes apparent to me that the people I'm in discussion with haven't actually read the project, right? They've written about it, they've criticized it, but they can't talk about the details of it. And so the 1619 Project has become a political football that people target because they assume they know what it's about. And here's the irony. I think if you actually read it, what you find is that, unlike some of the scholarship I was referring to a few minutes ago, which I would characterize as racially pessimistic, people who believe that perhaps there's no meaningful chance that the United States will really pivot in the direction of racial justice in the 21st century, will really face up to the historical and contemporary barbarism that is, right, so clearly written into our history and reflected in our contemporary distribution of wealth, income, resources, and power. We're just never going to do that. And so the appropriate reaction to understanding American history, if you care about racial justice, is bitterness. That's not the tone. That's not the content. That's not the conclusion of the 1619 Project. It is actually written in the spirit of the idea that reform is possible and that we can understand this history, that there's increasing willingness to reckon with it. And once we do, we can make the requisite changes. Similarly, I would suggest that this is actually a patriotic work. If by patriotism you mean an honest reckoning with the history of your country. And when I say honest, I will just point out my father, I'll start there, is a complex man. He's a human being, right? He has some really wonderful properties. He's incredibly compassionate. He also has made some pretty serious mistakes in his life. And in certain respects, those mistakes have not only hurt him, but hurt me. Having said that, I still love him. And it's part of appreciating the complexity of a real human being that you can say, right? Especially if the person is willing to acknowledge and maybe even learn from their faults and flaws, that they're worthy of our respect, that we don't have to believe that every human being, in order to be loved, is simply a ray of sunshine, a saint, a purely good being sent to us from heaven to brighten our lives. No, we love people in their complexity. And similarly, we can love our country in its complexity, in light of its faults, so long as we learn from those faults, which requires, of course, that we acknowledge and then begin to address those faults. And again, I think this is very much the spirit of the 1619 Project, which would be what I would call the spirit of the only kind of honest patriotism. So it's not because of the content of the 1619 Project that it's become a political football, that so many people are just vehemently opposed to it being taught in our schools. Why instead then? And I want to focus on two big factors here. The first, the way we use history in constituting our national identity. And I want to suggest, in a sense, every modern nation does this, but the United States does it particularly in a particular way because we are an immigrant, multi-ethnic, a multi-racial, a religiously diverse society. We don't have a story to tell about having a common ethnic, racial, national, linguistic background to unify us. What we do is we rest very heavily on our shared historical story of our peoplehood to integrate a diverse group into a unified nation. And so history is particularly important as a civic resource in the United States. And then when I say history, I have to immediately acknowledge, wait, there are actually two kinds of history here, and even that is a simplification. One kind of history is the kind of history that people at colleges and universities teach because they're trained professionally in a discipline, and that means that they're doing research and that they're reading other scholars who spend lots of time in archives and going to conferences and thinking about historiography, the method of history, etc. Right? So academic history. And on the other hand, there is civic and popular history. And that's what I was talking about a minute ago, the kind of history that's taught in our high schools, the kind of history that politicians point to when they try to tell a patriotic story of our nation, the kind of popular history ordinary Americans have in the back of their head when they think about their political identity or what makes our country worth preserving, advancing, in certain times fighting for, right? And those kinds of history, those two kinds of history, are obviously constructed from different perspectives with different purposes, right? Academic history, multiple perspectives taken on it. The perspective in part determines what you're going to find, but there are standards of academic honesty, integrity, verifiability, and then efforts to gain insight and purchase onto history by doing detailed archival historical research, right? And the popular history is really guided by a very different purpose. We're trying to create a serviceable story of what unifies us, brings us together, makes us care about each other. But to say that they're distinct does not mean that they're not also related, right? The national civic history can't simply be fabricated whole cloth, or it's simply propaganda. It has to be minimally historically plausible. And as academic history learns or discovers new facets of our actual history, our popular history has to determine how it can integrate those new findings into the story we tell of our nation. Now, academic history, right? From, let's say, the Civil War until the 1960s, I think was well described by W.E.B. Du Bois in his wonderful 1935 book, Black Reconstruction, as a profession engaged in malpractice, that it failed the standards of minimum scholarly objectivity and instead was serving the purpose of nationalist propaganda. And so if you look back, not just at the textbooks, but at the actual scholarly works from roughly the early 1870s to the early 1970s, you see, among other things, and it pains me a little bit to even say this, right, that slavery was a benign institution, that it was actually good for those who were enslaved, that they were torn from their country, thrown into the hulls of ships, carted for weeks across water where many, probably millions of people died, and then enchained, raped, beaten, killed, and systematically had their labor expropriated. That's a benign institution. None of that stuff is mentioned in so many of these books, as opposed to that, the idea that somehow slavery was a civilizing institution that brought, quote, African savages into, quote, the modern civilized world. Similarly, that the Civil War was an unjust war of the North against the South because the Northerners did not like the Southerners' use of their states' rights. The so-called lost cause narrative of American history is not just in our textbooks, it's in our historical scholarship for much of this period. And then finally, the story about Reconstruction, which is the one that Du Bois really focuses on in this work, is the story of what happens when you let Black people have power, and that is that they totally mismanage the state and tyrannize white people. Again, completely fabricated, obviously false, and yet again, this story dominates the historical scholarship that is produced by people at Columbia and Harvard, the most influential historians of America in this century-long period from the 1870s to the 1970s. And right? It's covering over the fact that actually Reconstruction was extremely successful. I won't go into the details here, but this is part of what this new historical scholarship is revealing to us. And then we begin to have a reform of American academic history, beginning in the 1970s as more and more Black scholars move into the profession, but also as white scholars, I'll take Eric Foner as an example, begin to really review this history from a perspective that is more attuned to the civil rights movement, more interested in examining the violence and injustice of white rule over Blacks, whether in the slave period, the Jim Crow period, or the post-Jim Crow period. And so American history really has been transformed and can no longer be criticized in the way Du Bois was criticizing it in the middle of the 20th century. And yet our civic history, right, whether it's what we teach in our schools or the popular narrative of our civic identity, has failed to adequately integrate the understanding from the new consensus. And I want to be as clear as possible. I don't want to say that is across the board. I suspect many of you are familiar with this history, that it doesn't sound like a radical cold bath of new information to you, but that it hasn't penetrated, hasn't been accepted or taken up by a large enough proportion of the American population to produce a new narrative, a new consensus, a new understanding, and that if anything, among the ways we are divided, among the ways in which we increasingly, as a country and nation, have two realities operating simultaneously, is that we have two very different versions of American history competing in the popular political imagination of American citizens. And this leads me to then the final point about history, which is that it's a fragile history, a fragile civic narrative when its factual basis has been refuted. And when a substantial portion of the nation knows this and rejects the previous hegemonic narrative, but another substantial portion continues to maintain that narrative. The group that is maintaining the false narrative against the evidence, in some sense, understands the fragility of their own position, the holes, the faults, the fact that it won't stand up to scrutiny. And very often that makes people more vehement, more violent, more censorious in the way in which they defend what they know deep down they cannot verify or validate. Let me conclude by looking at one further factor here, in terms of not so much the historical as the political reasons for resisting this. And I'll tick through these quite quickly, but there's a couple I really want to focus on. First, post World War II American conservatism has a fraught relationship with equality, especially post civil rights Republicans' rejections of racial equality, right? And so we go back to William Buckley, we can go back to all kinds of the most influential writings of post-war conservatism, and there's this dominant theme: equality and freedom or liberty compete with each other. They're not reconcilable, and America's chief political value is freedom, and therefore you have to reject equality. Second, and this is one of the two themes I really want to drill down on, the conservative movement is increasingly appealing to history as a bulwark against rapid cultural change, right? And so you can think of originalism in the Supreme Court. We have to interpret the Constitution in the way in which it was interpreted in 1789. That's the only way to understand it. And the sense is, I think, right, we are becoming a multiracial society. We are becoming a traditional society. We won't have a religious consensus. We won't have, in particular, a dominance of our power structure by white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men anymore. And many people are using their liberty to change their identities. How do we stop this? Well, let's appeal to our history and the value of our history. And lo and behold, this movement is saying, no, you can't do that, because the only way you do that is by fundamentally distorting our history. And I think that that is a major normative threat, a major source that the center doesn't hold, that our society can't integrate itself, and that this is then deeply disturbing to cultural conservatives. Third, and this again is another factor that I really want to emphasize, that reckoning with this history challenges our ability to reconcile the current distribution of wealth and power in the contemporary United States in the 2020s with the idea that we are a basically just, at least we became a basically just society, and therefore most middle-class white Americans deserve what they have. They are not profiting from a racial caste system, from unfair governmental policies. And this history makes it absolutely clear that that is false. And that challenges not just your sense of American history, but also your sense of being someone who has not unjustly benefited from racial hierarchy. This history makes it clear that, in fact, most white middle-class Americans are the beneficiaries of racial injustice in America in the 21st century. And that deeply challenges our sense of self, our sense of justice, our sense of deserving what we have. Fourth, a fear that a multiracial democracy is emerging and that it threatens the current distribution of power and resources. We've talked about this in terms of the great replacement theory, right? That if the history of the United States is the dominance of whites over blacks and other racial minorities, of privilege and subordination, well, if other groups rise, then obviously they're going to claim privilege and subordinate white people. I think nothing of the kind is manifest in the movement I'm describing to change the teaching of American history. They continue to subscribe to the ideals and aspiration of the American Constitution, the most hallowed and worthy ideals of our experiment, of equal rights, equal freedom, a society with no subordination. But nevertheless, many people can't envision that the power structure would change such that whites surrender their power and privilege without imagining some other group will then take their place. And so the stark alternative that faces many people today is understanding the true complexity of American history, and that means taking collective responsibility for its worst aspects and acknowledging that we don't necessarily justly deserve what it is we currently have, or else denying the truth about the history and whitewashing our historical injustice. And again, the fragility of the sense of justice, not just the fragility of the history, but when you recognize that the history is fragile, also recognizing your sense that I have earned what I got, I have worked for it and I deserve it, and there's no injustice, exploitation, or unfairness in it, that when you recognize that the story that you tell about yourself is actually founded on lies, that can be a very threatening position to be in. A little bit of evidence to back up these last claims, right? This is a study done by Michael Krauss and Jennifer Richardson at Yale and some of their colleagues, and it asked a bunch of Americans in terms of the distribution of benefits in our society, how much progress has been made since the 1960s. And three groups said, look, right, we're doing much better. The truth is we're actually doing worse, right? How much benefit has accrued to African Americans who have college educations in terms of their wages? Again, most people thought that African Americans had improved their situation dramatically. In fact, their situation is worse off today than it was in the 1960s. Looking at how high school affects education, same pattern. What the distribution of wealth in our society, much better, right, than it was 50 years ago? No, it's actually worse. What the distribution of income is, it's actually a little bit better than it was 50, 60 years ago, but Americans vastly exaggerate how much better it is. Similarly, when you ask people, same study, right? When we look at the change in the relationship between white and Black wealth over the last 50 years, how much improvement has there been in Black wealth relative to white wealth? Most Americans believe that Blacks now have around $80 to $90 for every $100 that Americans have, that white Americans have. The reality is down here, right? And you can see when it comes to income, when it comes to wages for people in general, or people who have college degrees, or people who have high school degrees, we systematically overestimate the movement in the direction of racial progress. And the authors suggest, right, that's the wealth gap, that's the income gap, that there's a simple explanation for this, right? That Americans engage in motivated cognition to remain willfully ignorant of racial inequality in general and racial economic inequality in particular, in service of our prevailing narrative of racial progress. That there's a kind of cognitive dissonance that takes hold if we don't do this, which is the sense that maybe we don't actually deserve what we have. And that's a hard truth to take to heart, especially if you're unwilling to do the hard work of addressing the injustice in our midst. And the problem with this history is that it makes it impossible to sustain the narrative of racial progress to equality. It makes us confront the persistence of racial injustice in our history. And that's a really hard barrier to overcome. So I'll stop there. I imagine you must have questions, comments. Who wants to start us out today? Have you guys read or looked at the 1619 Project, anyone? I'm seeing David nod and others, yes? Maybe,
well,
go ahead, who is this?
David.
Oh,
David
hi.
Pearson.
Yeah. See,
Yeah.
Right.
And symbolically, it's important that I'm wearing my Cal t-shirt today, because that's part of the symbol of power and authority in academia and in some ways in our society. But the last several minutes where you've talked about the maldistribution of power, authority, and what it would take to redistribute that in our society, as someone who spent 50 years in academia and rose to a position of respect, I feel like the only way that I can make anything better is just to step aside. Because if I hang around, I'll continue to inadvertently assume and enact authority that could more profitably, in terms of our goals for progress, be allocated to some other voices in the field. And so I face it as a personal, honest dilemma. I sometimes just don't know what to do, whether I should speak out even against injustice. Sometimes I feel that even that is an act of the usurpation of power and authority and voice that could be more profitably distributed to others. So I live with this. I don't live with it now here at Piedmont Gardens. I knew, and and appropriately, a large part of a community. So that feeling is less prominent than it was a year or two ago. But still, when I go back and read things within my field, I feel like I should do something. And then I say, hey, wait a minute, maybe it's just better to do what you can to promote the voices of others.
Interesting, David. And I'm gonna, I think, disagree with you slightly. And so I understand what you're saying. And that one of the things that we wrestle with in our society today, and it's part of the so-called lifespan revolution, right? We're living longer, we're working longer, and one of the results of that is that there's less, quote, intergenerational turnover, right? That the young guns have to wait longer for the old people to get out of the way in order to assume positions of leadership. And we got to figure out as a society how we reconcile the fact that people are working longer with sharing power with younger people. And so that's a real problem. But having said that, let me also point out that there is this term in the literature and the practice of the contemporary Black and racial justice movements, allies, right? And the idea being that they want white people in positions of leadership to be doing things that assist them in their struggles, right? And that they recognize that they can't do this by themselves. And so I guess one of the questions would be, David, you retire, you get out of the way, who fills your position, right? And if
Right.
you were an ally and you end up being replaced by somebody who's maybe less sympathetic, right?
Well, right. Can I just a quick
Yeah.
response? I understand the notion of becoming an ally, but I think what we need for some of us, my book on academia that I've never written was going to be titled "Young Turks and Old Farts," and now I'm an old fart, and happily so. But my point is that we need lessons, I think, on how to become allies and what it means to be an ally without unintentionally usurping the authority that could be redistributed elsewhere. That's my problem.
I want to completely agree with that aspect of it. And so to point out, one of the things we see, one of the aspects of white privilege is that white people are more comfortable speaking authoritatively in public, right? And so there's this unfortunate tendency for people in diverse settings to find that the white people are speaking more often and speaking in a way that is more confident, and that is a problem, right? And so I guess I'm encouraging subtlety in thinking about what it means to be an ally. That being an ally doesn't mean exclusively getting out of the way, but it does mean collaborating in the right way, in a way that doesn't manifest privilege, but instead works together respectfully in a way that seeks to undo the distribution of power. I see your hand, Barbara, and I saw you holding up Isabella Wilkerson's Caste and all the sticky pads in it. Yes, and by the way, the author I was speaking with you about, Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 Project, says her favorite book of all time is Isabella Wilkerson's previous work, The Warmth of Other Suns. Go ahead, Barbara. You just wanted to point out. No, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Doing that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Because David, my beloved husband, has spoken on his topic, I now have three things I want to say. Yes, caste. And the reason for the sticky notes is in my book group, I've given a presentation of this book. And of course, these represent more than an hour's presentation time, but that's what I've done. And I recommend it. And Wilkerson's first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, is about the Great Migration, for those who haven't read it, the Great Migration out of the South to three major cities in the West and East and North. Chicago is one of the cities. The second thing I want to say is that at my Unitarian Universalist church in Palo Alto, we have on Zoom, and been working on this for more than a year now, a group called Whites Dismantling White Supremacy. And we've listened to Being White, a series of radio broadcasts about that, which have really wakened us up in the best way of knowing things about how whiteness became defined. It didn't exist before our American slavery as a concept that people are white. So we're doing that hard work internally rather than just saying we need more Black people to come to our church. No, that's not our purpose or what we can achieve, and that would be kind of using Black people for our own aggrandizement. And the third thing I want to say is that David is modest. When he was dean of the College of, or the Graduate School of Education at Berkeley, he brought in people of minority and non-white backgrounds onto the faculty over the, what was it, David, 10 years or so that you were dean. So, he's done the hard work in his professional life, and together we're trying to keep at it in some way that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And I like all three of the comments, and you may have heard some of Wilkerson's vocabulary reflected in what I was saying today. And look, you can kind of see a couple of those shelves of books are on race. There's just tremendous good scholarship out there right now. And I can't resist sharing the story. So one of the first things I did as a young Turk before I became an old fart at Sarah Lawrence was to at some point at a faculty meeting, I had collected all the statistics on the diversity or lack thereof of the student body and the trends. And so I gave a kind of spontaneous presentation and suggested that we were failing as an institution. And the result was, no good deed goes unpunished. I was made the chair of a diversity task force to study what we could be doing as an institution. And we actually made all of these recommendations, and many of them were implemented. And so we now have a diversity committee and a dean of diversity. And I do have to say that this stuff doesn't always work the way you think it's going to work, right? And so it's not like you do your one thing and you've accomplished what you hope to accomplish, right? And so the law of unintended consequences, right? Often the solution to the problem generates the next problem, right? And so this is it's part of the reason to be rooted in the history is because the problem is so tangled, so complex, so difficult. It's not going to lend itself to a silver bullet. It takes a constant struggle and reckoning. But to be equipped to do it, we need to understand our history. And frankly, the old farts, those of us who get it or who've studied it or who are sympathetic to it, fine. But frankly, those of us who are resistant to it, threatened by it, it's probably too late to change many minds. I think it's too deeply integrated into identities. And once something becomes integrated into your identity, it takes a lot more than argument. It takes a kind of conversion experience to change somebody. And that's not a political project, right? That's something maybe the Unitarian Church can do individual by individual, but we're not going to do it through our politics. But having said that, the next generation, the kids who are still having their imaginations and identities formed, they can be reached on these topics. And I think it's one of the reasons that education, and especially high school education, has emerged as such a lightning rod issue is because the old farts whose identities have been shaped and who are very defensive in this historical moment recognize that their kids, if they're just exposed to the true complexity of American history, are going to form very different identities from their parents. And many people find that to be very threatening. Thank you, Barbara. I think it's the first time we've spoken.
Yeah.
So anybody else with a question or a comment for today? All right, everybody. I know we've gone long. It was a complex, I hope you'll agree, important topic that we were talking about today. Thank you for your attention and engagement, and I'll see you next week. Bye, everybody. Take care. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you both, Davids.
Thank you, John.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.